All right. Hi, everyone. I am Melissa Green, a Technology Accessibility Training Specialist with the Faculty Resource Center's Emerging Technology and Accessibility team. Welcome to this online learning opportunity for Technology Accessibility Liaisons. As mentioned in the event invitation, the purpose of these off-week Zoom meetings is to share the technical assistance provided during the biweekly accessibility meetings with those who are not in attendance. Meaningful alternative text was the topic of the technical assistance portion of the March 20th biweekly accessibility meeting. So if you attended that meeting last week, this will be a repeat. You're welcome to attend again as a refresher, or if you wish to exit at this time, no harm, no foul. This meeting is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be made available to all liaisons. I should note that this information was compiled by Dr. Rachel Thompson, and Rachel is the person who presented it in the March 20th meeting. It incorporates information from a WebAIM primer on the topic of alternative text, a link to which I'm going to paste in the chat. I'll also send that link out when I follow up with the meeting recording. That being said, we'll go ahead and get started. Adding alternative text or alt text for images is really a fundamental principle of web accessibility. We are emphasizing it sort of early in our schedule of technical assistance topics because it is one of the top 5 things we know that the Office of Civil Rights looks for when assessing the accessibility of a university's websites or online programs. It is a basic principle, but it can be one of the most challenging to properly implement. Like many things in web accessibility, determining appropriate, equivalent, alternative text is often a matter of personal interpretation. The key principle is that computers and screen readers cannot analyze an image and determine what the image presents. And a screen reader, just to sort of refresh everyone's memory about that, is a piece of software or an application that converts digital text to synthesized speech. This is the software or app that a person who's blind, many people who have low vision will use to access websites and other digital materials. Screen readers are also sometimes used by folks who have learning disabilities, those who learn better or prefer to learn by hearing text read aloud instead of reading it visually, or some who maybe learn better or access information by hearing text read aloud while they read the text visually. So again, as we often think of users with visual disabilities when we talk about screen readers, but there are also others who use screen readers as well. And as we'll talk about, alt text has other benefits beyond just ensuring accessibility for users with disabilities. So our job as content creators or managers is to provide text to the user that presents the content and function of the images within our content. The best way to sort of start thinking about alt text or what to provide as appropriate alt text is to ask ourselves, if I could not use this image, what would I put in its place? The term alternative text refers to the text equivalent for an image regardless of where that text resides. Alternative text provides a textual alternative to non-text content and web pages. Today, we're really going to focus on alternative text for images, but the principles can also be applied to other types of media or other non-text web content, charts, tables, graphs, smart art, clip art, word art, really anything that's non-text content. Well, alternative text serves several functions. As I mentioned before, it's read by a screen reader in place of images, allowing the content and the function of the image to be accessible to users with visual or certain cognitive disabilities. But alternative text is also displayed in place of the image in browsers, in email programs, if the image file is not loaded or when the user has chosen not to view images. So An example of this scenario that you probably experience yourself on a daily basis is when you use your email program. Um, Often because of security settings, images are not automatically displayed. If alternative text for an image is present, you'll see that text loaded instead, and that can sort of help you determine whether or not you want to display an image. That also may occur when a user is in an area of limited internet connectivity. Um, and that's why it's sort of beyond just accessibility, a nice thing to do to provide alternative text. I'm thinking of a situation in which I have limited data on my phone. I can't connect to Wi-Fi. I check my work email, and I see that there's an image, but I don't know if it's the script A in someone's email signature, or maybe an image of text that includes really important information. If the alt text is present, that gives me the information I need to determine whether I should use my data to download it. Alt text also provides a semantic meaning and description to images, which can be read by search engines or be used to later determine the content of the image from the page context alone. If you've ever used Google image search, you've seen this in action. One of the ways that Google determines which images to present when you do a search for an image is by looking at the alt text or alternative text that describes those images. Alt text can be presented within the alt attribute of the image element when we're working with HTML, or within the context or surroundings of the image itself. Alt text is not just found in alt tags or the alt attribute of the image element. It can also be provided in text adjacent to the image, within the page containing the images. In some cases where an equivalent, a text equivalent of an image can't be presented succinctly, such as a complicated or long infographic, a link and or a long desk or long description attribute that references a separate page that contains longer description can be provided. So lots of different ways for providing those text alternatives. But every image must have an alt attribute. Images that don't have alt attributes are likely inaccessible. In some cases, images may be given an empty or a null alt attribute, which we see in HTML represented as alt equals quote quote with nothing in between the quotation marks. And we'll talk a little bit more about the scenarios in which you'd use an empty or null attribute momentarily. So how do we go about determining appropriate alt text? We can start by asking, does the image have a function? In most cases, an image will only have a function if it's contained within a link or if it's an image map hotspot or a button. We might also ask ourselves, does the image present content? And if so, what is the content? Alt text should be accurate and equivalent in presenting the same content and function that's present in the image. When writing alt text, we want to be as succinct as possible. This means that the correct content, if there is content, and function, if there is a function of the image, should be presented as succinctly as is appropriate. Typically, no more than a few words are necessary, though rarely you might use a short sentence or two. Alt text should not be redundant or provide the same information as text within the context of the image. When writing alt text, we should also avoid using the phrases image of or graphic of to describe the image. It is usually apparent to the screen reader user that it's an image. So when, and this depends on the screen reading program being used and how the user has specified their preferences in their settings. But typically a screen reader user, as they navigate digital content, when they encounter an image, the screen reader program will announce that they've encountered an image. So it will say something like image and then read the alt text that's been provided for the image. So if you describe an image as image of a dog or a picture of a cat, the screen reader will say something like image, image of a dog, or image, picture of a cat. Those words, image of or picture of, are just redundant and unnecessary. If the fact that an image is a photograph or an illustration is important content, then you might want to include that in alternative text. And where that might be relevant is perhaps when describing images for an art history course. You know, it would make a difference whether the image being described is a photograph or a painting or an image of a mixed media piece, for example. When determining appropriate alternative text for images, context is everything. The alternative text for one image may be vastly different based on the context and surrounding of the image itself. So take, for instance, an image of George Washington, which is depicted on this slide. The alternative text for this image might change very much based upon context, as we'll see in the next few examples. So this slide depicts an image of George Washington with body text below that reads, because of his role as the commander-in-chief of American forces in the Revolutionary War, and later the first president of the United States, George Washington is often called the father of his country. What would be the appropriate alternative text for the image in example 1? Feel free to share a response in the chat. Our choices are A, image of George Washington, B, George Washington, the first president of the United States, C, an empty alt attribute, or alt equals quote quote will suffice, or D, George Washington. If you'd like to take a guess, go ahead and venture your guess in the chat. And we'll talk through these available responses. The first step, again, when determining appropriate alternative text for an image is to decide if the image presents content and if the image has a function. In most cases, an image will only have a function if it's contained within a link or is an image map hotspot or a button. Determining if the image presents content and what the content is can be much more difficult. If the content that the image conveys is presented within text in the surrounding context of the image, then an empty alt attribute may suffice. So in this example, the content being presented by the image is to inform the user that this is George Washington. This image has no function because it is not a link and is not clickable. And remember, context is everything. You're seeing this image and the body text in the context of a webinar. You're not on a website able to determine that the image actually has no function. So again, it kind of makes these questions a little difficult to answer, which I'll let you in on a secret. You know, we're doing that on purpose. So based on these rules, we think option D, alt equals George Washington, would likely be the best alternative text in this instance. Option A unnecessarily describes the image as an image. Option B provides extra information that is not presented directly in the image, and it's also redundant with the content presented later within the text. Option C, no alt attribute, is not appropriate because the image does convey content that is not directly presented in the surrounding context. And even though the surrounding text does indicate that it's referring to George Washington, visual users can tell this directly from the content of the image. So if the image conveys content, it should be given alternative text. Continuing with our George Washington example, this slide also depicts an image of George Washington with the caption, George Washington. Body text below that reads, because of his role as the commander-in-chief of American forces in the Revolutionary War, and later the first president of the United States, George Washington is often called the father of his country. So we have 4 possible choices for appropriate alt attribute for this image. A, George Washington. B, an empty alt attribute, alt equals quote quote, will suffice. C, image. Or D, the image does not need an alt attribute. Think about which of those you think is the best choice, and if you'd like, feel free to share your pick in the chat. In this case, the content of the image is presented within the surrounding content. In this case, the caption with the image that reads George Washington. So option B, alt equals quote quote, the empty alt attribute, is your best choice. Option A would be redundant. Option C provides extraneous and useless information. And option D, no alt attribute, is never the right choice. Every image, every type of non-text content must have an alt attribute, even if it's null or empty. This slide depicts our same image of George Washington, but this time that image functions as a link. So whenever an image is within a link or functions as a link, the function of the image must be presented in alternative text that's also within the link. In this case, there's no adjacent text within the link that describes the function, so it must be presented within the alt attribute. Possible choices here, an empty alt attribute. B, Wikipedia entry for George Washington, so that's describing where the link is pointing to. C, read more. Or D, George Washington. We believe that option D, George Washington, is likely the best choice. While the words George Washington and the alt attribute are redundant with the text that follows, in this case, the redundancy is necessary to adequately describe the function of the image. Option A, the empty alt attribute, is not adequate. An image that is the only thing inside a link must never have a missing or null alt attribute. And this is because the screen reader has to read something to identify the link. Screen readers might read the image file name or the URL of the page being linked to, and that may or may not be useful. And remember that the link could be read out of context of the surrounding text. One of the things we've talked about previously in our biweekly meetings is how screen reader users tend to navigate the web or other digital content. They may be using keyboard shortcuts that bring up a list of all of the links on the page and going directly from link to link. So when a link is read out of context of the surrounding text, those links need to be descriptive. Option B provides content that's not available through the image alone. So a visual user can't tell that the image links to Wikipedia simply by looking at it. So that is additional information that we don't need to provide in the alt text. And option C doesn't provide an adequate description of the function of the image, especially out of context. This entire example could be made better by placing both the image and the text caption within one link. So if both the content and the function of the link and image are presented within the link, the image can be given an alt, a null alt, to avoid redundancy. And just as we've discussed before, we want to avoid using link to or click this image to or similar wording in the alt attribute. Here's a slightly more challenging example. This slide depicts a painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware River. The body text below the image of the painting reads, "In this painting, the artist Emmanuel Lutz used light, color, form, perspective, proportion, and motion to create the composition." So let's look at some possible choices for alt attributes for this image. So possible choices include A, George Washington, B, painting of George Washington, C, painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware River, D, a classic painting demonstrating the use of light and color to create composition. And E, painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware River. Swirling waves surround the boat where the majestic George Washington looks forward out of the storm and into the rays of light across the river as he leads his wary troops to battle. So think about what your choice would be and why. Option A, simply George Washington, probably does not adequately describe the content of the image. The fact that it's George Washington in the painting may not necessarily be relevant in this context. Option B, painting of George Washington, may be adequate, but it really doesn't provide much additional content. However, it may be appropriate to describe the image as a painting, as opposed to a photograph or other image type. Option C provides more information that may help the user identify the content itself. So remember that alternative text is not just for users who are blind. Many sighted users would be able to identify the specific painting in question given this description, whereas George Washington alone would not be descriptive enough. George Washington alone could apply to, this painting or the example that we looked in the few previous slides. Option D might be appropriate if the purpose of the image is to present a specific art technique and the content of the image itself is not important. Option E may also be an appropriate alternative if a detailed examination of the painting is in order. However, that's really a little too long to be of much use as alt text. Such a lengthy, detailed description would probably be better served as text within the web page. What's the right answer? Well, there is no one right answer here. The best alternative text will depend on the context and intended function and content of the image. And again, this is one of the reasons why, while not particularly technically challenging to implement, alt text can sometimes be intellectually challenging to implement. The same image may have different alt text depending on its context and function. Images are often not only used to provide content, but also to provide important functions, such as navigation. This slide includes a screenshot of the navigation bar on a web page. The products image is part of the navigation bar. So looking at possible choices for the most appropriate alt attribute for the products navigation image in this example. Possible choices are A, products, B, link to products, C, a button with top to bottom gradient shading from pale to dark teal and white letters in sans serif font bordered on top by a goldenrod bar, and D, the image doesn't convey content, so alt equals quote quote or null alt will suffice. Think about what your choice would be. In this case, we think option A is the best answer. Option A, products, provides both the content and the function of the image. The image displays the word products, and it also is a link to the products page on the site. The image will be identified by the screen reader as being within a link. So link to is not necessary, which sort of removes option B. And because the image is the only object within a link, we shouldn't use null alt text. Null alt text is never appropriate. When an image contains only text, the text being displayed can usually be used as alternative text. So I'll say that again. When an image contains only text, so the only contents in the image or text, the text being displayed can usually be used as alternative text. Now, I see this a lot in our university context. let's say, for example, an image of the text where legends are made. In most cases, appropriate alt text for that image is the text that's in the image where legends are made. Many of us create digital signage for informational or promotional purposes, and then reuse the images we create to run on the digital signs across different platforms. So that digital sign image might also be used on Facebook, for example. That digital sign usually includes, let's say, the name of an event or program or service, as well as some additional information like a URL or a phone number, date and time, so on. In that case, appropriate alt text for that image of text is usually the text itself. So the same text contained in the digital sign image could be used as alt text for that image on Facebook or on a web page. This slide includes a screenshot of a portion of a web page. The text on the page reads, "Continue to the next page to read about George Washington's presidency." And there's an image of an arrow that functions as a link to the next page. What would be, I think what your choice would be, the most appropriate alt attribute for the blue arrow image in example 6? Next, next page, George Washington's presidency, or continue to George Washington's presidency. So next page, George Washington's presidency, or continue to George Washington's presidency. So again, this is an example that really doesn't have a clear-cut best answer. In fact, any of those options could probably be appropriate in this example. Option A and B will probably be sufficient in most cases, as long as it's clear to the user that there are multiple pages within the article. Option C, George Washington's presidency, very clearly presents the function of the link, but it doesn't really present that the link goes to the next page in a series. Option D, continue to George Washington's presidency, may be the best of these four solutions because it presents the function of the link and conveys that it's part of a series of pages. So, as has now been stated a couple times, determining the most appropriate alternative text really is up to personal interpretation based on the larger context of the image in question. What we know for sure would not be appropriate is a description of the image as arrow or blue arrow or blue and white right pointing arrow would not be appropriate. So because determining the most appropriate alternative text really is up to personal interpretation, something that you might consider incorporating into your workflow or publication or production practices is when you get content from content creators, subject matter experts, developing a PowerPoint, or someone who's writing copy and providing images for a web page, is soliciting the alternative text from them. Or at least asking them, why did you include this image? Or what is this image intended to communicate? I dealt with this a little bit. I worked previously in HR and I assisted some different areas on campus in developing some compliance training content that incorporate a lot of images. I was not the subject matter expert. In many of those cases, material safety was involved, and what I might describe an image as, man holding beaker, was not really what was being intended to be conveyed. Maybe what the subject matter expert wanted to convey was appropriate personal protective equipment, or safely handling different types of fumes. All of that to say that you might reach out to your subject matter experts or content creators in assisting you in determining appropriate alt text. Perhaps a better solution for that particular example with the arrow might be to have the text next page or similar adjacent to the image and within the link, in which case the arrow image could be given null alt text. This slide includes a screenshot of a portion of a web page. The text, download the employment application, and an icon representing a PDF file together function as a single link. So both the text and the icon representing a PDF are within the link. What's the most appropriate alt attribute for the icon image in this example? Is it employment application, PDF file, PDF icon, or, since the content of the image is presented in context, a null alt? So notice here that we've emphasized that the image is within the link. If the image were not part of the actual link, then the alt text might be different. In this case, because the image provides additional information about the function of the link, it's important that it be within the link itself and read with the link. And this is vital, again, because links are often accessed out of context from their surroundings. Option A is redundant with surrounding text. So the text in the link specifies that what you'll be downloading is an employment application. Therefore, it's not necessary to describe the icon as employment application. Option B is probably the best choice, though perhaps even more succinctly, just PDF would be sufficient, because it clearly provides the content that is being presented by the image, that the link goes to a PDF file. The function, download the employment application, is presented within the text of the link, so it doesn't need to be included again within the alt attribute. Option C, PDF icon, really describes the image itself, so it's not appropriate. Perhaps in another context, it may be important that the user know that this image is indeed an icon. I'm thinking, if you set up a guide for your web content creators about accessibility best practices, and you illustrated the use of PDF icons. In developing that page yourself, you might describe your icons as PDF icons. Option D, null or empty alt text, would not provide the important information that the image presents, which again is that if someone clicks on this link, they'll be navigating to and opening up a PDF file. Let's talk a bit about decorative images. Decorative images do not present important content, or are those that are used for layout or non-informative purposes, and that don't function as or appear within a link. In almost all cases, decorative or spacer images should have null alt text, alt equals quote quote, rather than something like horizontal line. So what would be the appropriate alt attribute for the horizontal separated image, such as the one shown on this slide? Decorative line, beginning of footer, separator, or null alt attribute, alt equals quote quote. Well, I just said, in almost all cases, a purely decorative image, alt equal quote quote, will suffice, and that is the case here. A description of the image isn't really appropriate. When an image is used only for decorative purposes, it is often best to remove the image from the flow of the page itself, from the HTML content, and add it instead as a background image using cascading style sheets or CSS. This will remove the need for alternative text at all and will remove the image from the semantic and structural flow of the page. This slide includes a screenshot from a web page. Rachel describes this type of content as warm and fuzzy. It's a stock photo of hands clasped in a handshake, and the body text states the company's commitment to customer satisfaction. So it's there to make us feel warm and fuzzy, essentially. Possible alt text for this image: A, handshake; B, businessmen shake hands to complete a contract; C, alt equals quote, quote, null alt will suffice, or D, we guarantee our professional services. When analyzing this example, again, we might start by determining whether the image is presenting important content. We would argue that it doesn't. In current practice on the web, many such images, images like this, are given descriptive alternative text, even though the images don't really seem to provide useful content. In this case, we think the null alt equals quote, quote, would probably be the most appropriate, because the image is there to make us feel warm and fuzzy. It doesn't convey relevant or important content. And we would null the alt to tell the screen reader user that they can skip right over it. Options A and B are descriptive of the image, but don't convey an equivalent of what the image itself is conveying. They just sort of describe what's going on, a handshake or two persons in business attire shaking hands. In other words, the image is mostly decorative. Option D is definitely not correct because it injects additional information into alt text. This is really bad practice. It is a way that sometimes people will attempt to provide additional information or to provide additional keywords for a search engine. And again, alt text isn't really designed to be used for that purpose. In many cases, you could ask yourself the question, if I couldn't use this image, if this image wasn't available to me, what would I put in its place to determine appropriate alternative text? In this example, if you couldn't put an image there, it's likely that you wouldn't even replace that handshake photo with anything, or that the text really conveys the same purpose as the photo. Thus, the null alt is probably sufficient. It is common practice on the web to have, backing up, talking about logos and brand identifiers. We see a lot of these, again, in our university context. There's some type of logo or brand identifier on the vast majority of our web pages. Identifying the logo as such as the example listed on the slide, alt equals Acme Company logo, is not really typically necessary. Pretty common practice is for the site logo to link to the site homepage. In this case, the alternative text could indicate just the site or company name, Acme Company, University of Alabama. You could also indicate if the logo links to the homepage, Acme Company homepage or University of Alabama homepage. We addressed background images a little bit a few moments ago, just some additional sort of comments about that. It is not possible to add alternative text directly to CSS or other background images. And that's why we would put decorative images in the background. Images that convey content should generally not be used as a background of a page. Sometimes image sprites or other background images are used to present content. If for some reason you can't avoid that, any content conveyed through that background image should be made accessible within the page markup. One of the ways that developers will sometimes do this, or designers will sometimes do this, is to use CSS to position the text off screen. If you'd like some more information about that, I'm happy to ask him, our web developer, to provide some suggested techniques. Other image types. Form image buttons, so an image that's used as a button on a form, must have an alt attribute that describes what the button does. Image buttons are often used to provide a more visually appealing or smaller or larger version of a standard form button. In this case, the alternative text should describe what the button will do when you select it, such as search or submit or register, place your order, and so on. When in equivalent alternative for a complex image, such as a chart, graph, or map, can't be limited to a succinct alt attribute. So remember, at most, we want a couple sentences in length. Then we should present the alternative elsewhere. So again, infographic, bar chart, table, other visual image that includes quite a bit of information and needs a long description. We might present the alternative content within the context of the page. So for example, a chart or a table, we could present the underlying data within the context of the page, or by linking to a separate web page that provides the longer description of the complex image. The link can be adjacent to the image, or the image itself could be linked to the long description page. The alternative text for the image should still describe the general content of the image. So to recap, alt text, easy to learn, may or may not be hard to master. Adding alternative text to images, getting that alt attribute of the image element on there is one of the easiest accessibility principles to learn, but can be one of the more difficult ones to master. Alternative text may be provided in the alt attribute or in the surrounding context of the image. I'll just add here that when working with web content, you often have a choice. So you do have the ability to add an alt attribute and supply content for the alt attribute. In other platforms or working with other sorts of publishing tools, you may not have a choice. Facebook and Twitter and Instagram have recently gotten a lot better about this. They actually provide the ability to describe an image in such a way that that description goes into the alt attribute, but not all social media tools have that ability. Again, sort of depending how you're publishing and where, you may not always have access to the alt attribute. So you can provide these descriptions, these text alternatives in the alt attribute or in the surrounding context of the image. Every image must have an alt attribute, even if it's null or empty. Alternative text should succinctly present the content and function of the image. Alternative text should not be redundant, meaning it shouldn't be the same as the adjacent or body text. And it also should not use the phrases image of, graphic of, picture of, and so on. Appropriate alternative text depends heavily on the image's context. That's what we saw in all those images of George Washington. Same image used in a different context may require different alternative text. Alt text of a functional image, like an image within a link, should describe the function as well as the content. Decorative images still need an alt attribute, but it should be null. If the image is redundant or conveys no information, use alt equals quote quote for the text alternative. And if the image is text, remember the digital sign examples where legends are made example, then the alt text should usually be the same as the text in the image. So this is the information that Rachel presented during our liaison meeting last week. We had a little bit of time then, and we do have some time now to discuss this and answer any questions you might have. So I'm going to stop here, and those of you who have questions or thoughts to share, I hope you'll do that now by typing in the chat or using the Zoom controls to unmute yourself and ask your question over the mic. Okay, I'm not hearing anyone attempting to ask a question over the mic. I do see a question from Ruth in the chat. Is there a good way to test alt text once it is created so one can see how it appears to someone? Oh, that's a great question. So this really depends on sort of where you're publishing the alt text, whether it's within a document or a web page, for example. Some browsers, you can see the alt text as a tooltip, so you can actually mouse over the image and the alt text that's been provided for that image will appear in a tooltip. So that's one way of seeing that when working with web content. Alt text does appear when using automated accessibility evaluation tools like Wave and AMP. So that would be another way to access the alt text of a web page. If you want to check or evaluate the alt text for images in a WordPress site, something that one of our colleagues in strategic communication showed us a couple weeks ago is the ability to go into the WordPress media library and check the alt text for several different images at once. Actually, let's see if I can do that really quickly. I have a little hourglass on my screen, so I may be locked up, but I think this is something that might be useful to several folks in the group, so I'm going to attempt to bring it up. So I'm sharing now, or attempting to share, the technology accessibility WordPress site, if I can get the password correct. So if you're working with WordPress, you can find all the images that you've uploaded to your WordPress install in the media library. So I'm navigating by selecting media, then library. Your dashboard may look a little different depending on how your WordPress is configured. You can actually see all of the media items here and edit their alternative text. So that's another way to sort of review all in one spot once the alt text has been created, so you could see how it appears to someone. Ruth, I hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to follow up with me directly following the meeting. Okay, Ruth says it does. Thanks. Yes, thanks for asking, Ruth. Any other questions or comments? All right, not seeing any others, I will thank you all for your time and your attention. As I mentioned, this session was recorded. We will be making that recording available once we've had it captioned. I'll send out an email with a link to the recording to everyone who accepted the invite for this meeting, as well as all of the accessibility liaisons. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.